today's edition of the Human School's Mindshift Cards Conversation, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. Each week, we will model brief inquiry conversation around one of the Mindshift cards in our Mindshift Cards pack. If you are interested in a pack, you can check them out at thehuman.school. And tonight's question is, how does not telling our stories create space for others to tell them for us? And this comes from our storytelling compass point. So how does not telling our stories create space for others to tell them for us? So I'm interested in hearing what you guys think about that.
I think storytelling is one of those things that people feel awkward about doing because they think it's like self-promotion. But what I would encourage people to do is think about storytelling not from your own lens, sort of your own ego, but through other people. And I think what we miss when we don't tell our story is that we actually miss the opportunity for other people to engage, interact, and potentially be inspired by that story. And so I think my answer is probably a little tangential to the actual question. But I do think by not telling our story, we either get a vacuum of no story at all, or potentially, some other kind of story gets filled in that we don't necessarily want. And then we sort of become victim to that. So curious what you guys are thinking.
So I agree with you. I think there's a danger to not telling our stories ourselves, but also being mindful of what stories we're choosing to tell. I remember when I first started teaching, I had a really tough time in the school that I was in. I had a tough group of kids. And I remember my mentor telling me, think about your day and choose a moment from your day that feels good. And then when people ask you, how was your day? That's the story you tell, because otherwise you run the risk of, if you are sharing, you're telling a single story over and over again that either reinforces a negative feeling that you have or that other people have, but also that it's sort of like self-perpetuating. And as much as that is a little bit overly personalized than I think our intention, perhaps, I do still think there's a need to be thoughtful of the stories that we tell. I think that often as teachers, we spend a lot of time focusing on, when we do tell stories, it's the grading and the planning and the behaviors. And I don't think that often the public is super receptive to that. I think that there's a strategic way to choose different stories to tell that might promote some more confidence and positivity around teachers, not as savior figures, and also not as sort of like, I don't know, the miserable whatever. I think that if we're thoughtful about the stories that we share, that we can help shape a better understanding of what's happening in our schools that can lead to more thoughtful conversations too.
I mean, the two things that I come to mind when I think about this are, number one, it's the part of this which has us telling stories together. I think that the self-promotion part is when we're busy telling other people's stories for them in order to elevate our status, which is a lot of what I see out in the world. So I think, to your point, Randy, it's if it's not our story to tell, then why are we telling it? We need to make sure that we're encouraging and supporting others to tell their own story. And then I think the other part of it is to Rachel's point, are we telling a story in the best possible way? And another way that I think about this is, sometimes we tell stories after the fact. And what I mean by that is, when we talk about like danger, it's like if you're telling a story because you're playing catch up with a narrative, you're cooked, right? So if you're telling a story to try to stay in front of a concern or an issue or something like that, and it's because you've kind of been caught not telling stories, it's pretty hard to recover from that. It's pretty hard once that story is out in the public. And I know that's a negative way of thinking about it, but with this question, the question is what's the danger in not telling a story? The danger in not telling the story is that you've created a vacuum. At the very least, no one cares about you or what you're trying to do. But at the very worst, someone comes in and they tells a story, like you had mentioned, Randy, earlier, that isn't in alignment or isn't something that you value. And therefore, there's this, I feel that we need to have a more intentional pressure, for lack of a better word, to tell more stories together. It feels icky when we're telling stories about other people for other people. And I think that's the other part of this, is that when we do it with others, it can feel safer and more about the building of the community, as opposed to being self
So one of the
promotion.
examples that I can think of is probably 2010, when we started to flip the switch to go one-to-one computing, which at that time was not a common thing. I think at least here in the Lehigh Valley, there were none, or maybe just a few districts that were doing that. And one of the things that we were very intentional about was telling the story. So what were the goals of this project, which had a name? And we actually set up a website with a domain, and basically teachers, students, us, everybody was like posting stuff. We would do it on social media. And part of the reason why we wanted to tell that story was the community was making a big investment in resources, financial, human resources, et cetera. And we wanted to make sure that the story of the good, the bad, and the not so ugly was getting out there. And it wasn't all great stuff. I mean, this was 2010. So there, an initial first one-to-one kind of things. But it was a great opportunity to be transparent. And I think the reason why we actually went through the trouble to set up that hub, those resources, was because we didn't want the few people in the community who were against it initially to be telling the story. So we were getting out in front of it. And we were also inviting everybody within the community, from parents to students to teachers to administrators, to tell stories. And at that point, it was just like short blog posts or links to student work and things like that. But we were telling a story, and we were connecting it to what the outcomes and the goals were of that particular initiative.
We've batted around why people don't tell their stories, and I'm wondering if any of our thinking has evolved or changed around why we think people might not choose to tell their stories. Again, I mentioned the fact that I think it's one of those things where the proactivity in telling stories is always, not only is it like, does it feel better, but in the end, it actually ends up saving you time or saving you whatever it is that you think that you're saving yourself from. But I'm just kind of interested if either of you have any additional thoughts beyond the whole time or lack of confidence, if that's
I also think about perhaps platform, that I think the self-promotion piece ties into it. The feeling of like, where am I going to tell it and who cares? And then if I put it on a place like social media, does that feel like weird and icky? Like I am an overthinker, obviously. So I would get kind of wrapped in this idea of being afraid to be perceived as speaking for the whole, right? That in telling my story, that people can take it and decide that therefore I'm just like all teachers, right? Or everybody in a certain area thinks like this. So I think there was often anxiety about it, of not wanting to be perceived as speaking for the group, and not understanding or not being sure of where to share, not only because of finding some place that felt purposeful and worthwhile, but also safer, I guess. You think about like people sharing stuff on Twitter and the amount of vitriol that can come back to you depending on, I don't know, the day, the hour, the moment. So that can, I think, be unnerving. I also think being provided or afforded the space to do so. We talk about leadership and the importance of that. And I do think it's important for leaders to also share their own stories, because I don't think that there's a lot of that either, or it might be like one leader, two leaders in a place. But wondering whether or not there's space being made for people to share those stories, whether it's intentionally in a faculty meeting or in a classroom, or teachers making space for their students to tell their stories. So I don't think that any of us should, and we have our a mind shift about, leadership being a choice. I don't think that that means that we should all wait for someone to create space, but I do think that that often happens to people. They don't know where, but then they also don't feel like they have the space to, whether it's students, teachers, leaders, etc.
There was something that I was going to add, but it totally slips my mind. I hate when that happens. Oh, that's exactly
okay.
what it
That's
was
why we're
about.
learning
It was
in
about
public.
learning in public. And I think that, learning in public is really storytelling. And I think that, one thing that I know Chad has oftentimes said, and it's amazing how your comment just like popped this back into my head, but you've made this, the comment about, oftentimes the stories that we hear in public are the ones that are like, the polished, shiny, perfect product. And everybody's sort of like, oh, geez, they got their shit together, man. I can't tell my story because my story's like a total mess compared to that. And I think that, our system has drummed into our heads that, get it right the first time. If you have to iterate, then you're just like, not skilled enough, or you don't have the right knowledge set, or just give it up. And and I think people don't want to tell the story because of that too, because we've been told that, conceal the messiness and only put the good stuff out there too. And I think we could be guilty of that too ourselves. And I do think that we could probably be a little bit more transparent about our learning as well. And that's something that I want to make a personal goal going forward. But are we telling the story of what we're doing here as much in public as we could be? I guess that's one of the questions that pops into my mind.
Yeah. Love it. Thank you so much, guys, for another great conversation around our Mindshift cards. And we want to thank all of you for learning alongside us this evening. Don't forget, you can check out our conversations page at thehuman.school. And we hope that you'll join the conversation in being committed to placing humanity at the center of all design. Bye for now, guys.